I need you to really think hard about this and respond when you have the right answer. Your salvation depends on it. You doubt that, huh? Okay. What is the most famous chapter in the Old Testament of the Bible? What would you say? Psalm 23? Psalm 23. Okay, I heard a lot of Psalm 23. It's pretty simple, really, isn't it? I mean, generally we tend to think it's a go-to for a lot of things. We say Psalm 23. If I ask you what is the most famous chapter in the New Testament, that's going to get harder. Yeah, I mean, you think of verses and things like that, but you don't generally tend to think in terms of chapters. It gets a little harder. That's a verse. You read ahead. 1 Corinthians. Where I'm going to be this morning is I'm going to be in the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. So if you've got your Bible or an app or something, get it open, get it out there in front of you. We're going to kind of walk through this chapter together this morning and see. It's a very, very famous chapter. It's a chapter that's, when I was preparing this morning, I thought, you know what, I don't know when the last time that I actually preached on this chapter was. I really don't remember it. I know that I use it at pretty much every wedding ceremony that I'm a part of. I quote this from a variety of different translations or even interpretations. And it's used an awful lot. And the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians is, what do we generally call this chapter? Yeah, we call it the love chapter, right? And I think appropriately so. What's strange to me is that this 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians fits right in between two other chapters in 1 Corinthians. Chapters 12 and chapters 14. Now, what's significant about that? And I think it's highly significant, is that those two chapters are about spiritual gifts. And we know a lot about the Corinthian church from history and from the Bible and things like that, is that the church in Corinth was probably one of the most gifted churches, and it was probably one of the most confused churches. I always love it when people come to me with their whole theology of spiritual gifts and those kind of things based on those chapters in 1 Corinthians, when in fact Paul is writing this letter to clear up a whole lot of things. And so they had these gifts that God had given to them, but they weren't using them very well. And so Paul has to write in the middle of this, and he drops it right in the middle and says, I need you to understand some things. And so this is one of those things where the chapters in the Bible are somewhat strange. But at the end of chapter 12, he says, and now I will show you the most excellent way. He's talked about all of these spiritual gifts. But now that he comes to a break in the action, he's saying, now I want to show you the most excellent way. He said, I want to show you what matters the most. I really want you to get this, and I want you to get this good. You realize that when the Bible was written, that there were no chapters and verses that separated those things. Those were all put in at a later time, and there are various stories as to how that took place. But the chapters and verses, those are not God-inspired, but they help us to find our direction sometime. But there at the end of chapter 12, after he's talked about spiritual gifts, he says, I'm going to show you the most excellent way. I'm going to show you the best way to go. Now he drives his point home as he turns the page into chapter 13. And he says this, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but I don't have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And he goes on in the next verse. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and even if I have a faith that can move mountains, but if I have not love, I am nothing. And he says, even if I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but I have not love, I gain nothing. So you're saying all these spiritual gifts that we talked about here, if they are not undergirded by love, they amount to absolutely nothing. As a matter of fact, at the end of this, he says, and now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. Now that doesn't play very well in modern Christianity. Because the only thing that matters in modern Christianity is faith. Now, I agree. It goes back to Augustine, a bishop years and years ago, said it's our faith. We are saved by our faith through the grace of God. And I agree with all of that. But Paul, when he has the opportunity, says, here's what really matters. He says, it's love that matters. Now, he was building on something here, because if you look at your New Testament, you have the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they tell you the events in the life of Jesus. And then we go into the book of Acts, and it tells us the history of how the church unfolds in the first century. And then you get into a whole bunch of letters, which are really commentaries on everything that Jesus had just said. Now, Paul is writing a commentary on everything that Jesus had said, because Jesus brought a new concept of love to these people. We find it, the Greek language, which is pretty closely associated to the Aramaic language, which is what the people of the first century in Palestine spoke. Very closely associated there. And in the Greek language, there are different words for different kinds of love. And the kind of love that was being used most of the time by most of the people to describe most of the things in the world was the Greek word eros. It's the word that we get the word erotic from. Now, I think that sometimes that gets overdone, that erotic is just about a sexual type of love, and it's certainly more than that. But it is about a pleasuring love. And most of the people, even the philosophers of the time that Jesus came to speak, they were using the word eros. Jesus comes, and when Jesus says things like, particularly in that discourse that Sam quoted from last week, which by the way, you will notice that Sam made a little bit of fun of me last week, and he's not here this week. I'm not sure what that's about, but that passage talks about when Jesus introduces a concept of love in there, it is not the word eros that he uses, it is the word agape. And the word agape is different from eros in that agape, where eros focuses on self, the stuff that I'm going to get, the stuff that's going to pleasure me, agape love focuses on other people and what's good for them. And so now, he brings to us a new concept of love. And quite frankly, I got to tell you that I believe that it's really, really time that Christians stand up for a biblical concept of love. Because I think we've lost ground, and we're back to the whole kind of eros type of love, whereas it feels good to me. And people say, well, you've got to love me, or if you don't love this group of people or this religion or any of those things, if you don't love them, well, see, that's all about how it feels to them. What I'm going to do this morning is that I'm breaking this down just a little bit so that we can define what he's talking about. And I put them into groups. There are several things that are talked about here. So, like I say, we're just going to walk through this chapter together. And so it starts out in verse 4 with two words that he uses there. He says, love is patient and love is kind. Those two words describe one thing. They describe generosity. Don't they? It says love is patient and love is kind. And we break that down. We know, okay, love is, when we're called to love, we are called to be, there needs to be a patience in our love. And we know that we need that because patience, that aspect of love, that is what helps us to put up with difficult people in desperate situations. And if we didn't have that patience, and the actual Greek word there means it's an emotion that stretches out over a long period of time. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't be able to tolerate a lot of the stuff that we see going on. But here's what Paul says. He says someone should understand this agape love. It's generous, it's patient, and it's kind. Because that's what kindness is. Kindness is a generosity in our lives, and it's something that we need to hold on to and attach ourselves. Generosity is an important word in all of Christianity. And I mean, put it this way: if I asked you the question, if I said, "Do you love this church?" Most of you would say, "Yeah, we love this church." If I asked the question, "Are you generous to this church?" Now I'd get a variety of different answers to that. But Paul says, right out of the gate, he says, here's how love expresses it. This is what love looks like. That's what he's telling us. He says, first of all, it's patient. And it's kind. It is generous to people. Love is reflected in our generosity. Now, please don't misunderstand. When I use the word generous, I'm not just talking about finances. Unfortunately, we tend to go that, and particularly, really unfortunately, within the confines of churches today, is that you tend to hear generosity just tossed about in terms of finance, but it's much more than that. It's about the way that we deal with each other. It's about the way that we relate to each other. It's how we love each other. Love is patient and love is kind. It's generous. He goes on to say, love does not envy. Love doesn't boast. Love's not proud. Love's not rude. And it's not self-seeking. I'm going to group those together and say that there's a common theme there. And the common theme in here is that love is not only generous, but it's humble. Because these things are about, I want to do what's best. I mean, love doesn't say, I want to have what you have. It doesn't envy. Love doesn't boast and say, I'm better than you are. Love seeks to lift and boost others up. Love is not proud. It doesn't say, man, look at the stuff that I've done, but maybe it says, look at the stuff that you've done. Love's not rude. Love's not self-seeking. Love is humbling. It's humility. Because you see, if I just read these two verses, what love does is it releases me. It honestly does. It releases me from a preoccupation of myself. It focuses on other people. I'm not so worried about myself. And unfortunately, we've all gone through this. Man, I have been there. I have been there in times when people were really going through something. I mean, somebody is sitting there and they're facing this really desperate surgery that maybe has some life or death implications. Or maybe I've sat there in people's rooms where they have just suffered an incredible loss. And somebody comes to them in the name of Jesus and wants to tell these people about their indigestion. They spend so much time talking about themselves. I know a lot of that sometimes is because we're nervous and we don't know what to say to each other. But the fact of the matter is we need to focus on each other. It's not envious. It's not boastful. It's not proud. It's not rude. It's not self-seeking. It's humble. And it shows itself in this courtesy. It's not rude. It's courteous. And sometimes courtesy has to come out in the words that you withhold. Sometimes there are things that you think, well, you know, I've just got to say this to somebody. And maybe you don't. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But love is generous and love is humble. It's humble. Goes on to look like this. He says, love is not easily angered, and love keeps no record of wrongs. Okay, I'll just skip through that. Because it'd be really good if we could take out the words not know, right? It is easily angered, and it keeps record. It'd be good if we could do that, but Paul, through God's inspiration, says no. It's the opposite of that. Now, what I call this is I call these two things love's restraint. Love's restraint. Love is not touchy. That's a tough one sometimes, and it's particularly a tough one in our Christian society of today. Is because normally when I talk to somebody and they say, well, I'm not going to that church anymore, I'm going to this church over there, I don't care what it is, but normally, all too often, the gist of the conversation is, well, somebody there ticked me off. Somebody made me angry, and so I don't want to be a part of that anymore. And to be honest, it takes everything within me to say, to stop from saying, grow up. I'll be honest with you, when people come to me and say, well, I'm not going to that church because I don't like those guys anymore, I usually tell them, you know what, you need to go back there and work that out. Because you're going to find the same thing here. We are imperfect people. And I am an incredibly imperfect person. And you're going to find that. But Paul says that love in God, it has a restraint. It's not touchy. Kind of reminds me of the story of the prodigal son. In the 15th chapter of Luke's gospel, Jesus tells this story about the son who went out and squandered his inheritance, and then he comes back. And it tells us that when he comes back to home, that his father is really, really glad to see him, but his other brother is ticked off. The older brother is ticked off. It says, as a matter of fact, it says they're having a party for the younger brother who is returned. And the other brother says, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go to that party because he ticked me off. You see, love is not about being easily angered. It's understanding. It's understanding that we are people. Now, I'm not saying that that's a license just to do and say whatever you want to say, but I'm saying that there is an understanding that God has put inside of us, and when we choose to love, then we have some restraint. You see, the truth is, if we don't, it turns into something, and we call that something a grudge. Because if I hold something against, if I'm angry with someone for a long time, I end up holding a grudge. And the problem is if I hold my anger against a person for a long time, I will invariably end up hating that person. That's a very dangerous place to be. I love this because, like I say, I generally tend to use this passage of Scripture at wedding ceremonies, and I shoot through all this stuff and say, love is patient, and love is kind, and you can just see the smiles on their faces just getting bigger and bigger, and thinking, we can do those things. And then I say, you know what? And love keeps no records of wrong. And their faces just fall. We need to ask ourselves a question, a very important question. What good comes out of the anger that we do hold on to? The answer is nothing. We never accomplish anything by anger that we hold on to. Now understand that there are some times when we should be angry. The Bible talks about anger. It's a natural emotion. And it doesn't presuppose that when we become a Christian, we're not going to be angry at anybody. It just says you don't hold on to it. You don't let it stay there. You learn to love. You learn to love because nothing good comes out of when we don't allow it to go through. Now the next thing is that he says gets passed over a lot, and I don't know where I'm going with this. It says this. It says, love does not delight in evil. but rejoices in the truth. How many times have we heard, well, you shouldn't criticize somebody because look at Jesus. All Jesus was about love. Don't criticize somebody's lifestyle. Don't criticize somebody's choice of a false religion. Don't criticize those things because that's unchristian, is what we're being told. And I want to tell you that sometimes the most loving thing that you can do is confront. Because you see, if you take the world's viewpoint of don't criticize somebody else, just love them, then that means that we allow people to go head first into a Christless eternity without talking to them. Now, please understand that I don't know any way in the world that you can construe allowing someone to go to hell without talking to them about it. I don't know how you can construe that to be loving. I don't. And I think as Christians, we understand that the same Jesus who looked at that woman who was caught in prostitution and said, I don't condemn you, the next thing he says is, stop sinning. Don't do that anymore. You look at the book of Galatians, it commands us as fellow Christians is that we need to help others. Part of what's carrying each other's burden is making sure that we help people through sinfulness. But that's a part of love that sometimes we don't want to see. We don't want to focus on. But it says it doesn't delight. Oh, that's great. That's wonderful that they have this modern relationship. They have this modern bent. And so now society's gotten into this little game where they say, well, if you don't like something, if you don't support something, if you don't stand behind it, you are phobic. Doesn't matter what it is. Doesn't matter if you're Islamophobic or homophobic or any others. Let me tell you something. The only phobia that I have is I have a fear of allowing people to go to hell without having made a stand. Because that's what love does. Now realize that there is a balance in these whole things. I mean, the guys who are causing out all kinds of ruckus and disturbance, and there's that group out of Kansas that sometimes stands and makes a mockery of people's funerals or those kind of things. They don't have any balance in their life. They don't have any business doing what they're doing. But at the same time, we don't have any business saying, well, I'm not going to say anything about it. We'll just let God judge it. We don't. We have a responsibility to love. Because love is honest. Ephesians chapter 4 talks about that. It talks about speaking the truth in love. And all too often people tend to say, well, those are at opposition to each other and need to be blended together. No, they're the same thing. Truth is love. And love is truth. And we have a responsibility to move on to that and make a difference with that. Then he goes from there and he says, look at the words that I've highlighted. It always protects. It always trusts. It always hopes. It always perseveres. And love never fails. I mean, God is calling us to live like this. And this, my friends, is love's consistency. This is love's consistency. Because it always does. It always trusts, always hopes, perseveres, protects. It doesn't fail. So Paul says, you want to know what love looks like? I mean, he said, you got all these spiritual gifts and you're doing all of these things that you think are really cool. But let me tell you, he says, let me tell you about what really makes a difference. And he says, as a matter of fact, you better get my point, because he says, even if you can do all kinds of things, if you got faith, he says, that can move a mountain, but you don't have any love, you are pointless and worthless in your life. He says, get this. Get the whole picture. It's not okay to say, okay, well, I'm going to take this part of love. I'm going to take the kindness and part of the patience thing. And kind of thing, I think I'll be okay with that. You can't take part of it. You take the whole thing. So here he is. He says, here's love. You want to know what love is? It is generous. It is humble. It has restraints. It is honest. And it's consistent. And it's consistent. Now, after I have read most of this chapter at a ceremony, and I, by the way, I don't detail it at a wedding ceremony like I did here this morning, because people are never there to hear a thing that I've got to say. They're just waiting for me to say, kiss the bride. That's what they're waiting for me to say. And so I've learned not to waste my breath. They just want to gush over a beautiful bride. They don't seem to appreciate the fact that I usually wear a suit and a tie. But after I read this, I say, you know what? This is what love is. This is what love looks like, and it is a very tall order. Can you do this? I'm thinking to myself, when you came to me and asked me if I would do your wedding and told me that you wanted to get married, I would say the same thing. I would say, why? And they always do the same thing. Well, not always, but most of the time. They look at each other like two cows dying in a snowstorm. That's what it looks like to me. And they say, because we're in love. I say, you got a better answer? I mean, are you really ready to love each other? Are you really ready to love each other? And Christian, I ask us the same questions this morning. Are we really ready to love each other? Are we really ready to love the world around us, to allow God to do these things in us? And then I tell them, this is a very tall order. And you know what I know? You can't do this. Not by yourselves. You can't love each other, not by yourselves. And they look at me like I just killed Romeo and Juliet, you know? They say, it's all about love. That's all there. I mean, have you ever read Romeo and Juliet? Those are two sickos. They really are. I mean, look at that story. That's crazy. But I'd say to them, and I say, you can't do this by yourself. You don't have the strength. You don't have the power. You're going to keep record of wrongs. You're going to get angry pretty easily unless you allow the Spirit of God to control your life. Unless you say, God, I understand. Things have changed over the years when I Started my ministry 40 plus years ago. When couples came together, they said, oh, well, we're going to be together until the end of time. Now they tend to come together and say, we're going to be together until it's convenient or no longer convenient. And I say to them and I say to us, God has called us to love each other. Right in the middle of that, Paul says, you know what, I don't care about your stinking spiritual gifts. And maybe that's a sermon for another time. I don't care. I don't care how many tongues you can speak in. I don't care how much you can prophesy. I don't care. Do you love each other? That's what I want to know. Because clearly the church in Corinth wasn't very good at that. Because God had given this incredibly beautiful picture, what we call the Lord's Supper. Other people call it the Eucharist, or they call it communion, or I don't care what you call it. You can call it whatever. You can call it frank as far as I'm concerned. But it's a time when we come together and we remember the sacrifice of Jesus Christ for us. And Jesus had left us. Jesus had said, I want you to do this to remember me. Here's the one thing that I want you to do to remember me. I want you to come together and I want you to share in this time where you recognize the body and the blood of Jesus Christ. That's what Jesus said. Those are his marching orders. By the way, that's why we do it all the time. Because I'm not in the business of trying to change his orders. But what had happened in Corinth is they turned it into a mess. Because the church in Corinth had too much of society blended into it. And they took the practices and they said, you know what? These are really good practices out there. And the really fascinating things that are going on, those are really going to attract people. And so what they'd done with the Lord's Supper, and history bears this out, is that they had their own little groups. They didn't have communion together. They had it in their own separate little tables. Maybe say we had tables around here. And say this group was at the table, one table, and another group was at another table over here, and a group at a table back here. And what was happening is that they would get in their table and they would have their own meals. Now, this table over here was just made up of people who liked each other, because that's how we decide what table we're going to sit at. And so they're over here, and they called each other up on Saturday night. Sent texts back then, I suppose. But they had a plan. And they said, what I want you bring the fried chicken this week. And I'll bring the mashed potatoes, and you bring, and they had this set up. And they had this really cool meal going on over here. But these guys over here, they didn't have any money. And if they did have a little bit of money, all they had was enough to go to McDonald's. And they'd made a mockery out of the unity of the Lord's Supper. Because they didn't share. Somebody over here didn't say, hey, you know what, man, I got a drumstick left. Anybody over there need it? No, they just boxed it up and took it home. And these poor guys back here with McDonald's, they weren't sure if they were going to make it through the service or not. They know at some point in their life it was going to affect them pretty badly. Because they didn't love each other. Because their love was erotic love. It was about themselves. But what Jesus had called them, and Jesus calls us to, is not erotic love, but it's agape love, a self-sacrificing love that cares about other people, that cares about Jesus. That is generous, that is humble, that sometimes is very, very honest, but it's always consistent. And it's a tall order. And we can't do it by ourselves. But we can't stop there and say, well, guess we're not going to make it. Because Paul concludes this chapter with these words. He says, these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is real love. The greatest of these is not a fake love that passes over things. The greatest of these is real love. That cares more about somebody, cares more about their salvation than anything else. And we're called to simply get on board. God, I pray this morning for my friends, that you would help us to walk where you've called us to walk. And most importantly, to love as you have shown us and called us to love. Help us to not settle for a cheap substitute. Help us to allow your Spirit to come inside of us and change us and give us genuine agape love. And Father, if you're hitting on somebody's heart today, help them to talk to someone. Maybe come talk to me. Just help us to see where you're leading us, Lord, not where we're leading ourselves. Help us to use your wisdom, your words, in your ways, today and forever. In the name of Jesus.